Okay, we're going to do Mage Knight now. Unlike most games that I cover, I'm not going to go into full depth in the rules in this. The main reason is I'm sure there are better rules introductions out there. This is a popular game, and I'm not really all that interested in parsing through them. I do it largely because after games like La Grande Guerre that are pretty rare, some people really wanted to, get some information on how to play something. Great. Well, I don't need to do that here. But I do need to give you an overview in the unlikely event that you only watch my stuff and don't watch, or at least don't watch, anything by other people who are kind of more popular game associated. I know Rado, for example, did a run through of it, etc. Although I don't know how much he does the rules. He kind of bases them into the game, which I may do to some extent. Okay. So a little bit on the intro side of things as to what happened with this. This is a game I've had my eye on for a long time. It's been out for a while. It's been very popular. I like fantasy, adventure-themed type things, character-based. If you've watched, I did Magic Realm. I'm trying to think if I did any others. I don't really have a whole lot of others. I have Wizards. Magic Realm's kind of hidden away. Wizards is somewhere in here. There it is. I don't know how many I actually have. Like, I don't have the Hero Quest type stuff that I get a kick out of. I have Citadel of Blood. That counts. Anyway, it's a style of game that I like the idea of. Unfortunately, there aren't many that I really enjoy playing. I have Talisman. Okay, I play that a lot, or played that a lot. There aren't a lot that, or there aren't any that I've seen that totally satisfy me. It's just not the same experience as a role-playing game, and that's sort of the nature of the beast. Well, I saw one on sale at an auction. Included a couple of the expansions for I think a little bit about the price of the base game, I guess. Maybe a little bit more than that. I ended up paying too much on it overall, probably, but the seller was really cool and threw in a copy of Across 5 Aprils, which makes it all seem worthwhile greatly. Anyway, my wife and I started playing because she's very into the idea of character-based, kind of wandering around type of stuff. And I'm not sure either of us really, really loved the game, but we became addicted to it. In the sense of, this is what we were playing instead of Dominion. We actually haven't been playing Dominion much at all. I'm sure we would get back into it if we started playing again. But, picked up the expansions. The remaining expansion that I didn't have, which is Shades of Tesla. Played through most of the scenarios. I noticed there's a couple of basic game scenarios that are the original game scenarios that I have not played yet. But we did everything else at least once. And, there's a lot of room there. You have, the scenarios are configurable to make them more difficult, essentially. Okay. So this particular scenario we're doing is sort of the exemplar of the game. This is really what the game was designed as, and then everything else is kind of like, let's add this little thing, or let's change the goals a little bit, or whatever. But this one's the conquest scenario, and what I'm going to be doing is 4 players running through in a competitive game. You can configure this game in so many different ways. So some of the scenarios are meant only to be played as kind of co-op or solo games. But yeah, for all of it, you can play solo, co-op, and then for many of the scenarios, you can play competitive. And you could probably twist the solo co-op scenarios into competitive games as well, just depending on how you wanted to play. In a sense, though, all of them are semi-co-op. It doesn't really spell it out and nail it down, but it gives you that flavor. And the picture that I like to take for this is, okay, you're these generals attacking, to conquer this territory that was once under another empire. And you may or may not be, you're not necessarily particularly good guys, and you're striving to get a combination of points that add up mainly on this track as fame, but there's a lot of end game points that come into play that get added to your fame as being the person who did the best job on the board. And the competitive rules are basically, you do the best job, you win. Okay. But there's a group victory as well, which is, in this particular scenario, it's going to be to capture 4 cities. If the group as a whole fails to do that, I see it as shifting the victory conditions. Okay, so the person who wins, if you succeed in the goal, is lauded as the great conqueror and all this, that, and the other. The person who wins, if you fail at the goals, I see as kind of the person who's not blamed, who doesn't suffer like execution for failure or something like that. They probably get demoted or whatever, but overall that the scale is anybody involved in a game where the goal is reached has done better than anybody involved in a game where the goal is not reached. How different players want to interpret it, that's their own thing. But that's how I tend to look at it. The full co-op, you don't bother even scoring amongst different players. You just get a group score. Okay. I have not put all the pieces out that I'm going to need. Let's grab a few of these. We're going to need more, but okay. So let's take a look at some of the components. So over here you have 2 decks of troop. This is a semi-deck building game, which means, if you're used to like the Dominion type deck building, it's not going to play out like that. The amount of cards that you add to your deck is very small compared to what you tend to add to your deck in those games, in Dominion and Ascension. I don't know, I think I have another one out there. So your player is going to start off with a deck of 16 cards, most of which are in common with the other players, although each player has 1 initially, and then with expansions it becomes 2 cards that kind of differentiate them. What they also have is a cute little mini as their piece for their thing. These shields, which are going to be part of their experience level representation. And as they go up in levels, these move over. These become slots where they can hold allied troops, whereas these show some stats for the character. I can briefly tell you those. The number over here is their armor value, or how much damage they can take for each wound that they take. How much damage is involved in each wound that they take. The number over here is their hand size, and then this indicates the levels at which they're at that. These are just markers used to mark places you've explored on the board. They also are used on the various tracks. This stack here is your skills, and that's referenced here, and this is what really differentiates the characters. They're different abilities, whatever, that your characters have as they go up in levels. There are things that they can do either every time it's their turn or once per day or night, as it were, which are called rounds. A day or a night is a round. Okay. Over here you have a track that keeps track of how much fame you have, and as you go up in fame, you go up a level. So for example, this level, what it's saying is, hey, you're going to gain a skill and you're going to gain an advanced ability card, which gets added to your deck. It actually gets added to the top of your deck, so it'll be in your immediate draws, which is important because there aren't a lot of reshuffles in the game. And these are going to generally be stronger than the cards that you have in your hand, and they also count for some victory points. Over here, this is your reputation track. As you do things on the board, you kind of gain the goodwill of the populace, or you might really lose it. And that affects how you interact with the natives. I like to compare this game with Magic Realm because I think it's kind of like a, not really a simplification, it's more of a distilling it into a pure kind of thought game in a lot of ways. It's not as much of the walk in the woods type thing that my wife really loves and that didn't really come from this. This stack over here is spells. Like the advanced abilities, you get to add them to your hand, but you don't get them just by going up levels. No, other things. So when you go up to this level, or this layer of the board, you'll flip over a shield, and then they alternate like that throughout the game. This is your wounds deck. They get added to your hand, so they have backs that are similar but not quite the same depending on what expansion they're from, etc. There's a little bit of color differentiation. Components, there are some definite issues. Shades of Tesla had some real serious issues in the first printing. WizKids, I think, is the producer of this. They actually stepped up and said, oh, we'll correct that. But they didn't correct all the issues from old stuff as far as I know. So like there are counters. Every counter in the game, you know, in any game basically has one side that's kind of convex and one side that's concave. Well, instead of always printing, you know, the symbol as to what kind of piece it is, which, you know, because they're random and hidden, is kind of important. On one side, there's some mix-up in them, and they may have corrected some of them. They have not gotten them all, though. I know the runes have some in them, and I know some of the player skills are that way. This final set is a set of artifacts. They and the spells both get thrown into onto the top of your deck when you gain them in general. And then you'll draw them into your hand and be able to use them. And they have special abilities. I'll talk about them as they kind of come up. But basically they have a power that you can use in general and a power that you can use by destroying the artifact, which is stronger. The spells have a power that's used normally, using mana, and then another power that uses multiple manas, always one black and the base color, and has what should be a stronger effect. Then you have troops. Initially all the troops on the board or on the table are going to be these from the gray deck. Later on, as we get further into the game, about half the troops will be from the gold deck. These guys show some interesting information. First of all, this is the cost and influence that they're going to be. We'll get to that in a bit. This is where you can recruit them, and you pay this influence to recruit them. Over here is going to be their armor factor. That's how much damage they can take when you wound them. We'll see how that works. This is their level, which affects a few things, including victory points. And then they have abilities, sometimes more than one, usually more than one, sometimes quite a few. And some of them will have a special cost. So for example, this guy can attack or block 3 normally, but he can fire attack or fire block 4 if you spend a red mana instead. In general, those guys can only be used once in any given round, and then they fatigue. And the way you mark that, let's say I had this troop, he would be under my shield. I have to have a shield slot for him. And then when I fatigue him, I drop the shield up like that, so that I know that I've used his ability. There might be a potential for me to, bring him back into a ready state where he can be used again, but that's fairly rare. All right, what else do we have? We have these tiles. Some of them are already set up. There's different configurations to the board you can use. I'm using the wide open configuration because I have a lot of players. I'm going to be playing with 4 people, so I want a lot of room for people to explore. And 2 players, I like a wedge shape, which comes off here and is a sharper thing. This is actually going to, I don't know if I can do the open world simply because I don't have all that much table space, and I wouldn't really want to be moving it all around if somebody goes exploring this way and somebody goes exploring that way. So I'm probably going to keep it to 3 or 4 columns, maybe 5 columns or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, So, what do we got here? Okay, some of them have green on the back, some of them have gold. The ones on gold on the back are generally going to be at the bottom of the deck. There might be some restrictions on what pieces are put in. For the green ones, those are countryside tiles. I just shuffled them up and put them on top according to the number that I'm supposed to have. I have some excess ones over here. If we run if we run through all those, we know we've got enough to complete the scenario then, but then the excess tiles can be discovered as well, unless the scenario doesn't seem to support that. They don't clearly state you can't make the map bigger in most of the scenarios, but some of them it seems like you shouldn't be able to. This one, it's not going to be any harm. Let's see what else we have. We have... Oh yeah, the critters themselves. So there's a bunch of different types of critters, and they show up in different spaces. So for example here, these are orcs. They're going to be rampaging orcs. That's just what they're called. We have a number of different terrain types on the board. They're all going to be spelled out with these cards that tell you what happens when you reveal one of them, and what you have to face if you go and interact with it in various ways. All right. The other thing you have is these dice, which have 4 basic mana colors on them, which are green, blue, red, and white. And then they also have black and gold. Gold is suns. During the daytime, you can use them as a wild card and use them as any kind of mana. Black is moons or something. They only count as black mana, and it's only really usually available at night. There are some exceptions where night rules apply when you're underground or something, and you can use black mana in those, which is kind of neat. We've mostly set up the game. There's always going to be 3 of these advancing ability cards available. I always get them confused with skills. There's always going to be 3 spells available. The number of troops available is based on the number of players, as is the number of dice in the mana pool. At the beginning of the game, you roll a bunch of dice from the mana pool. There are some restrictions. You have to have at least half in basic colors, basically. You shuffle up your deck of cards. You set up the board, and you pick your characters, and you draw a hand equal to your hand size of 5 cards in general. And then you're ready to rock. And each player is going to do one thing. This is at the beginning of a round. Each player, in kind of random order, will pick one of these specialty cards as to, this determines 2 things. One, it determines the player order. So early bird goes first in that round. Well, but the others all have special abilities on them that allow you to maybe, get some extra cards or have some other advantage during play. Most of them are used once. There are a couple that just are used in each one of your turns during that round. There's a different set of these cards when a night turn happens, and over here, this board flips over when it's nighttime. That's important because the movement point costs for different terrain are listed here for daytime and for nighttime. Does that seem all that exciting? Well, woods are very difficult to move in the nighttime, and they have the daytime in small value, whereas deserts are easier to move through in the nighttime than during the daytime. And you can figure out the whys of that. Okay. In between rounds, you do a little bit of mechanical maintenance on the board. Basically, an attribute, a spell, each go away and get replaced by new ones. Normally, whenever you take one from the offering, a new one shows up. And troops, all the troops get cleared and a new set is brought out. Those do not get replenished when they're taken from the offering. Likewise, there might end up being some of these abilities over here. In fact, there should be one anyway because there's a monastery. So I'll draw that out and put that down here. That's an ability that you'll be able to get from the monastery only. and you pay an influence, it costs like 6 influence. You can also sometimes buy spells in certain places. Okay. I think we're going to pause for a little bit. The basic player turn activation is you have a handful of cards, and you're allowed to take, there's going to be some of these dice that you rolled at the beginning that are sitting in here. You're allowed to take one of these out of there in order to fuel the mana needs for something. Most of these cards have a basic, well, all the actions have a basic ability, which is one thing, and then usually, but not always, a more powerful version of that if you pay a mana you can do. And the way you do that is you have a handful of cards and you say, so this is my deck. Okay, I want to move a lot of spaces, alright? Well, there's no green mana. Then I'm screwed. Unless I have something I haven't pulled out yet. Which are these? These are crystals. There's going to be a pile of these available for everyone to kind of use. And through certain capabilities, you're able to usually turn mana, but you're able to obtain crystals of the 4 basic colors. Red, white, green, and blue. You're allowed to hold up to 3 of them on your card, and you just pile them up, and then you can use them as an additional source of mana. There are other things that sometimes allow you to use an additional source of mana. For example, this. Hey, if I play the basic ability of this, I get a blue, white, or red mana token, which is basically one of these crystals, but I don't put it over here. I just have to fuel a card with it during my turn. I leave it out in front of me for my turn. I can play as many of these cards as I like, but my limitation is really the mana supply. Since I'm only usually allowed to draw one of these dice, and black is useless during the day, I don't have too many things I can do. So in this case, well, I can move for 2. Now, I have some influence things, so if I could get to a place where I could use my influence, that would be nice. At the beginning of the game, you start off here and you just appear here if you're off board, and then you can begin moving, and you pay the movement cost listed over here. So with a move of 2, I could only move 1 space, basically, unless I had some other abilities. Spells work a little differently than the abilities. They always cost mana for the basic level, and the more advanced level is going to cost the same color mana plus a black mana. And that means you almost assuredly have to do something special to draw the mana out. You can also only draw black mana when it's nighttime. Okay. At the end of your turn, and I'm not going into all the details of what a turn is, you have sort of an end turn action that you can take. And that might be, if you wander by one of these rampaging creatures, if you move from one space to a space directly next to it, it's going to attack you. Now, it wouldn't do it in this space because the walls have special rules, but you know, if we were like this, and I moved from here to here, this would then stop me, and my special action for the turn would have to be to fight it. Alternatively, I might move into a space like this, and then I would have to fight that. And the way fighting is handled is kind of complicated, to tell you the truth. And it depends on circumstances, because player versus player combat's a little different than player versus monster combat. Okay, so what you have with a critter is a number of values on them. And this one has 3 down here. That's how much fame it's worth if you kill it. Over here is its attacks. In this case, it only has 1, and all the critters from the basic game only have 1, but some of the expansions add multiple attacks. Now, the rules have kind of morphed throughout the game, and you kind of have to piece them together. What is it? The Legion of Doom or something like that, which, I don't know, kind of changed, the Lost Legion, kind of changed the way attacks and blocks work. But basically, in order to block this guy's attack, I have to do it with all one string of things. I can't just create a bunch of block and combine it. So anyway, that's how much attack he has. He also has an armor value. Now he has some special abilities here. The 6 here says if I don't block all his attack, it's going to take 6 hits to kill him. But if I manage to block his entire attack, this is because he's sneaky or something, I only have to do 3 hits to him to kill him. And then this is a special ability over here which says I can't take damage that he produces onto any of my allied creatures. I have to take it all on myself. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of combat. But essentially what happens is if I'm fighting this, there's 3 phases to the combat. The first phase is the missile phase, where I, as the player, am allowed to fire anything that's listed as missile combat. I don't know what it's actually called. It's probably called ranged or something like that. Or siege attacks. Those can be combined, and the goal would be to overcome the creature's defense. Well, in this case, the creature has a normal defense of 3, but a 6 if he hasn't been blocked. I haven't had an opportunity to block him in the ranged combat state, so I can't use those. There are additional factors with this. You can't use ranged combat against any creatures that are fortified, and anything that's in a castle, a keep here, or a tower, or a city is automatically 1 level of fortified. You can't use siege weaponry against anything with 2 levels of fortification. Also, the walls add another level of fortification, so it would be double fortified into here. Assuming that doesn't have a no fortification symbol to it. Walls prevent rampaging monsters from like attacking you, but you can still move in and attack them. You can also normally, like, if I moved from here to here, I provoked him. But if I move from here to here, I don't have to provoke him, but I can at my choice. And that means he'll attack me. But I couldn't do that if he was behind a wall. Anyway. So the first step is the ranged weapon. And obviously that's kind of cool because you don't get swung back at. Then the next step is my block phase, where I have to allocate all of their damage, or I have to allocate blocks to prevent each of their damage. Any block that I create can only be used against 1 creature. I can't split it up. I can't, use it in any kind of weird way. So there are cards here that might have a fair amount of block. Here's a ranged attack is what it's called. That might have a fair amount of block. That's 2. Okay, so this has a block 5 when it's used on its exceptional level. That might be more than I need for a given creature, but I can't split that card up and use it against 2 different creatures, like a 3 and a 2 attack. That's a limitation that's kind of painful, to tell you the truth. Okay, any attacks that I don't block damage me. And by me, I'm being kind of broad here in the sense that I include my allied units that I could have with me. So, let's say I'm alone. I have a defense of 2. If an attack of 4 were to hit me like this guy, well, 2 goes into 4 twice, so I would take 2 wounds, and these would go into my hand. If I take a number of wounds in one turn's, in one combat that equals or exceeds my number of cards that I can hold in my hand, I'm knocked out and all my non-wounds get discarded. And that's a problem because that means I don't get to act in the next step, which is my attack phase. Now, I could have fired missiles at him, but then I wouldn't be getting shot up probably. Okay, and then the third step is the attack step. Now, unlike the blocks, you can kind of combine attacks however you like. Sort of. Except for when creatures have special defenses. In which case, they all are kind of affected by the special defenses if you clump them together. So in those cases, you might need to separate your cards out, and that makes life a little more difficult. That's really a brief overview. Player versus player combat is similar, except that both players get to do each step at once. So, and there's some other little things there. So, the first thing is whoever's the defending player in a player versus player combat has the choice of passing their next turn in order to get all the abilities that they would have in their own turn's combat, which means normally if you don't pass your next turn, you don't get to draw a die from here, you don't get to heal after combat, and you don't get to draw a new hand after combat, which means you'll be weaker on that next turn coming out of it. Player versus player combat. First you get the ranged and siege effect, and the defending player gets to fire first, and he gets to fire all his ranged and siege effects. The damage is allocated. Now it's allocated a little differently. I'm trying to remember how it's done. I believe it's the attacker who gets to allocate it, and he has to overcome the armor. He has to equal the armor, like he does with these critters, in order to cause wounds. Instead of wounds, he could give you movement points to retreat you from a space, which could be pretty important. He can steal crystals from you, stuff like that. And then the attacking player gets to fire ranged combat. Then you go to the regular attack phase, and here the attacking player gets to swing first. So the attacking player probably doesn't really need to use ranged combat unless, well, ever, really. Because anytime you have a ranged attack or a siege attack, you're allowed to agglomerate that in with your regular attack phase. They're just faster. All the special abilities and all that we'll kind of cover as they come up and discuss them during play insofar as they're of any interest. When you kill something, you get fame for it, listed here. You might gain or lose reputation. With these rampaging monsters, you gain reputation for them. 1 point for greens, 2 points for reds. There's all kinds of... So there's a whole lot of special cases and, you know, little pieces to this that make it a very difficult game to describe all at once. And I feel like the best way to handle it is to jump in, start playing, learn your mistakes. If you screw up, you screw up. What the hell? I'm fairly familiar with it. And I'll talk about what the scenario victory conditions are. I'll also talk about, as we play, what the different effects of different places on the board are. You know, so for example, you don't know, hey, what's this? Well, this is a mine. If you sit there at the end of your turn, you get a crystal at the end of each turn. Crystals are really important because remember, you have a limit to how much mana you have. You're faced with a lot of decision making, a lot of calculating, and almost on a very minuscule sort of level where you don't really feel like you're making heroic decisions here. You're making card balancing and play decisions here and trying to calculate out how you can, you know, kill the most critters in one battle or whatever, or which critters you can face or what things you can do with the hand of cards you're dealt. In that, it doesn't feel anything like, you know, the sort of walk in the woods type thing that sometimes Magic Realm manages to feel like in some other games as well. The Hero Quest type stuff and things. And that's kind of disappointing. But it does present you with some really interesting puzzles with this sort of thematic overlay of what you're doing. I don't find myself playing this and really getting too much into the characters or any of that. I find myself playing this and getting into, you know, the puzzle solving aspect of it. All right, well, let's load this up and then I'll go into what the scenario is. Like I said, I'm not going into a full rules overview. I'm also not, you know, expecting any of you to learn the game from any of this. I'm just fiddling around with it so that I have the street cred to give my review. I kind of want to play it solo at least once. I don't think it's going to solo very well. It does have solo rules. I'm not doing that. I'm going to be doing the multiplayer solo that I always do. The pure solo rules are of very little interest to me. I've played the co-op rules. What happens with those, I should at least explain them a little bit. What happens with the base game solo rules is there's going to be a dummy player, and you basically they get a handful. I don't even remember how they quite work. They get a handful of cards, and if they draw a color equal to their character, they pull a mana out. And what they're doing, something I haven't explained yet, what they're doing is basically they're a timer. Once their deck runs out, the round is over. if you haven't ended the round yourself. Now, as a player, you can end the round. Yeah, there's a few things I haven't explained. As a player, you can end the round by passing on your turn. If you pass on your turn, everybody else who's playing gets one more turn to do things. And there's some special restrictions, usually, some scenario-based, some otherwise, on what you can do at the end of once the round is ended. I think you can't do player versus player combat, for example. And then you hand out, you reshuffle your decks, you re-roll the dice here, you reset some of these values, and the scenarios usually have a limited number, well, they always have a limited number of rounds that they play in. And if you don't succeed in your goal by those limited amount of rounds, well, it's over no matter what, and however you want to assess victory. The other thing I didn't explain is the concept of resting. Well, also another thing. At the end of your turn, you can discard any regular cards that you have. But if you rest, you're allowed to discard one or more of your regular cards and as many wounds as you like. Now, they stay in your deck and they'll come back and cause problems. There are other ways to get rid of wounds. There's healing, which just gets rid of them. And then there's also magic glades, which kind of heal, but they can only get rid of them out of your hand. And there's spells and stuff that do stuff like that. The other interaction that you're allowed to have, we need to pause. For rest, you have to give up your entire turn. The other thing you're allowed to do as an action, and there may be some others. Yeah, there are a few. So one is you can go into a location. Now, what is a location and what is not is kind of has to be explained on a per item basis. So like these labyrinth type things or mazes, these are locations. The monastery is sort of a location. If you decide to burn it, it's kind of treated as a location. These castles are not. These are things that you actually enter and you automatically attack. Ruins are a location. There's just this... Anyway. If you go into one of these kind of adventure site locations, is I guess what they're doing, you have the option to encounter it. In which case there might be some monsters or something you have to fight, and there will be in here. And then a treasure or bonus that you get for defeating it. And that's all spelled out on the cards form. That can be your action for a turn. The third thing that can be an action, the first is fighting, something that's just face up or one of these. The third thing that you can do is if you're in a location where you can interact with natives, you can interact. And what interaction does is it allows you to play cards. Well, you can play cards for influence at any time, but it allows you to use your influence to buy stuff. What stuff can you buy? It depends on where you are. But in the general case is troops. And you look on the board, so like these guys can only be bought at monasteries. So if I was in the monastery and I had 7 points of influence, which I might have here, this is 4 base, but I could get 5, 7 if I had a red mana, although it would cost me a reputation. I could take these and add them to my troops. I can only have as many troops as I have little shields like that, slots for the troops, but I can discard a unit and replace it with a new unit that's healthier or better in some other way. Even just a fatigued unit, I can say, okay, you're gone, you're fired. Where I am is a village. So I look for villages, and the foresters come in the village, and the peasants come in the village. So those would be the 2 things that I would be able to buy there. Now, in different locations, you can also do different things with influence. So in the village, every 3 influence, I get to heal a wound, which can either be off my hand, or out of my hand, or off of one of these units. At the monastery, it's only 2 points to heal. In addition to the troops that might be available in the monastery, there's also skills, advanced actions that might be available at the monastery. Each monastery generates 1 per round. As soon as a new monastery shows up on the board, a new one's placed. I also have the option to attack villages and monasteries. If I attack villages, I don't get much. I get a couple of extra cards in my hand. If I attack monasteries, I get to burn it down, and that's worth some victory points at the end of the game. And I get an artifact, which is pretty cool. But it also hurts my reputation big. And basically, each little space on the board has its own special rules, and these cards cover what they reflect. Cities are going to be the goal of the scenario I'm playing, and they're these things. We're going to have all 4 of them. They have, I can't really do it one-handed, but they have different numbers on the bottom, which indicates their difficulty, and it also indicates what's there. So this city has, I believe, 2 red critters and a tan critter to defend it. And as it gets more difficult, bigger monsters show up, and you can set it weaker as well. And then it also has this card that comes with it, which gives it a defensive, an advantage for the people defending it. So, for example, here, if you're doing if the monsters inside of it or whatever are doing physical attacks, they add the brutal capability to it, which causes more damage. So that's kind of tough. Down here is if the city has fallen to one of the players, there's an additional purchase. So one thing is you can purchase anything that comes from cities. Now, nothing comes from cities in the troop list that we have here. Once the gold tiles start coming out, we start getting the gold cards. Those will be more likely to be found in cities. And all the cities are on gold tiles. But in this case, I could pay 12 in order to get an artifact. Cities have multiple critters defending them, like this has 3 critters defending it. Each person, when they kill a critter, gets a shield on the city, and they have a share of the city, and they get some of the bonus in the city. One of the bonuses is they get additional influence in the city for each shield they have. Everybody can walk in there, and they can't fight once it's been captured. But it also, the person who has the most shields in a city gets 2 extra cards if they're adjacent to or in that city. If they have any shields in the city, they get 1 extra card. The keep actually works kind of similarly, except only one person can own a keep. You can attack a keep and take it from someone else. I think that's the only thing you could do that with. All right. I think I've covered most of it in sort of a haphazard sort of way. Enough so that, if you haven't looked at the game in some other context, you at least have an idea of what the hell I'm doing, I hope. All right, let's send this up.